Good morning. Welcome to Humanity Meets Business, Business Therapy with Christine Salvo. Today I have such an exciting guest. He's a repeat guest from a while ago. If you haven't catched this past episode, I highly, highly recommend it. So Joshua Wenner is back. He is a veteran, an entrepreneur, and an acknowledged leader in the field of leadership and resiliency. He helps people navigate the messy parts of life. By the end of this episode, listeners will learn how to navigate grief and trauma through a technique you created, but also really working on the 3 tiers of resiliency that he has worked with many of his private men's groups and other events that he has done. So Joshua, welcome back. So happy to have you.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Always fun to hang out with you.
Yeah, so a lot has happened since we met last time. So just to kind of recap, kind of the takeaway from our last episode was a technique you called CPR. And if you wouldn't mind just briefly kind of re-explaining that before we go into the 3 tiers of resiliency.
Sure. Yeah. CPR, the reason you would use CPR is typically you need to resuscitate somebody. So think of somebody's almost think of like unconscious. And so that's when you would typically use traditional CPR to resuscitate somebody to bring them back. So the metaphor that I use CPR for is emotionally. When somebody moves into the part of their brain, which is the back of their brain called the reptilian part of the brain, they move into a reactive state or a fight, flight, freeze, and appease state. And when we're in that part of our brain, we're literally in reaction. We lose access to executive functioning, compassion, empathy, and it's almost like we revert into little adolescent children. And so our brain is trying to protect us and to get away. So when we become, the C stands for consciously aware that we're in that reactive state, that's the C in CPR. We want to recognize first, if we're there, we're offline. Literally, I use this example, it happens a lot in families, probably daily. The fight about the dishes is not about the dishes. Somebody's in an activated place and they're offline. And so instead of getting in a fight, you can literally go, conscious awareness, see somebody's in an activated place. The P stands for pause, stop. And the R stands for regulate. And the R is regulate your nervous system. So you can come back online. When you come back online, you get access to compassion, empathy, and executive functioning. Meaning, in that same scenario, let's say you walk in the door and let's say your spouse, instead of saying hello, is obsessively cleaning, or you feel ignoring you. Instead of getting upset and moving into fight or conflict or avoidance, or again, that fight, flight, freeze, or peace, you could stop, regulate, which we're going to get into a regulation strategy in a moment. And then once you're regulated, you could say, I have compassion, I have empathy. What else could be going on? They could be in an activated place. And maybe you walk up to your spouse and say, hey, looks like you had a tough day. Do you need to talk about it? Mm-hmm. And if you use that, it's going to go in a totally different trajectory than if you start to react with your fight, flight, freeze, and a peace.
Yeah, well, I can second and third that. So now moving into, so thank you for that recap, because I think that's so important. And, if you've listened to that episode, great, you probably needed a refresher. And if you haven't, that's an excellent tool just to start with. We all get activated. It happens to the best of us. I literally had a situation today where I was like, man, I lost my temper, and it's actually kind of hard to get me there. And I'm proud of that, right? It takes a lot, but I finally hit a wall, and it was like, all right, here you go. and then I was like, maybe I went too far. So half of the CPR method is just avoiding the future issues that you're going to have to clean up later, right? So if you're not so mindful of your partner's state or what's going on, and you're reactive, you're more likely to have more problems because of that had nothing related to it, rather than just nipping and going, can I be attentive to you? So thanks for that redirection. I love that. And I don't think there's anybody that can't benefit from hearing that probably every single day.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And once you learn it, you realize this is all day, every day. Social media, spouses, children, at work, it happens all over the place. So use it. Highly recommend use the tool if you're listening.
Yeah. So today, we kind of talked about what you wanted to really discuss next, which is kind of like this next level here. So you talked about the 3 tiers of resiliency. I'm not familiar with this model. So as you're telling the audience, you're also educating me, which I love. That's one of my favorite parts of doing this show. So wherever you would like to start, let's kind of start talking about resiliency and why it's important and all the things.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we're training fire departments or police departments or military, this is just a process under resiliency that we've created under Valor. And so there's three components of resiliency. The first component is reintegration, and I'll put it into context. A lot of times we get ready to go to work, let's call it, and some people have to put the armor on if you're a therapist or if you're a doctor or a firefighter or a police officer. There's a lot of careers, a teacher, a counselor. There's a lot of roles where you have to put some armor on to go to work. And so you are getting ready, putting the armor on, going to work. However, a lot of times we never take the armor off to come home again. So you have to be highly aware that if the armor's on and you're taking on emotional debris, or you're taking on conflict, or you're taking on, you have to put armor on to do your job. Really important that you take the armor off, because if you don't take the armor off, that's where a lot of the problems happen at home, because you can't feel emotionally if you're disconnected. All your relationships, your family, your spouse, your community, your own connection to yourself happens underneath the armor. So if you can't take the armor off, you can't reintegrate back home. You can't actually get into those emotional states. So first thing is reintegration. Make sure that if you reintegrate to work, that you have a reintegration process to come home again.
So break that down even more for me. So, and in a minute here, I'm going to actually have you define resiliency, because these are words like, if you're in the community and you're a healer, like, you're going to understand what this means, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have a blanket kind of definition or even your definition. But taking the armor off, how would you go about that? Like, how would someone know that they don't take it off, number one? And number two, what are some ways they can?
Yeah, great practice. And I'm actually going to get into that when we talk about the next two, which is
got it.
purification and regulation. But it's just important to note, because a lot of people just, like, I'll give you another metaphor, which I think will help you ground that. Think about it. If you've been, like when you're working with people are working with chemicals and they're in those big chem suits. Imagine if they don't take the chem suit off. Typically they walk into a room, they blow down the chem suit, right? They suck all the air out, then they take the suit off, and then they come out of the area. So imagine if you didn't allow that to happen and you just brought all that home with you, right? So the big metaphor is, make sure you develop a practice to reintegrate back home again, and the process of taking that armor off. And I'm going to talk about some different ways that people can do that in just a minute, but it's just really important to have a process. It can't just be, I go home again. Or if you work from home, what is your practice of going from leaving your office to walking downstairs again, or however that looks for you? And the ways you want to think about this are, typically when we're working and we have armor on, we're disassociating from emotion. And a lot of times we're dealing with stress. And when you're dealing with stress, your nervous system's what's called in a sympathetic state.
Yeah.
And when you're in a sympathetic state, what ends up happening is essentially blood gets pumped to your larger, your legs and your arms, so you can run and get away. It's actually meant to allow you to escape prey or predator. You have your pupils get dilated, your hair stands up, and basically non-essential organs all shut down. So essentially reproductive system, your digestive system, all these systems shut down, because you're just meant to get the job done, to either get away from prey. It's a protective mechanism. We look at it every day as like normal stress because we're so normalized to it, but really it's meant as a certain for a certain reason. So if you're, let's say in a context, if you're a firefighter and you show up to a scene and you get into a sympathetic state, you move into that state so you can handle things, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're a teacher, you may be in these high stress states dealing with kids or conflict or whatever else is happening. So big picture, we got to have a process so that we can change out of that state, or we can regulate ourselves to get into a different state. So there's two primary things to pay attention to. One is going to be regulation, and the second is going to be purification. So you tracking so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And I like to use a metaphor of a truck just to make it simple. Imagine if you were driving a truck and you didn't know how to read the gauges of a truck. So what would happen if you didn't know how to read the gas gauge and you just
You'd run out of gas? Right? You'd be on the side of the road.
Exactly. And is it kind of a pain if you run out of gas?
Definitely.
Right?
I used to do it a lot when I was younger. It was mostly a money thing, but it'd be like, I think I can make it.
Right. So it's a pain, right? We don't feel like doing it.
However, a lot of time and money.
but you run out of gas a couple of times and you realize, wait a second, I read the gauge, I see the gas is low. I'm going to have to take the time. I'm going to have to spend some money. It's going to be a pain, but if I don't do it, the cost is worse if I break down on the freeway, let's call it, versus if I go get gas. So think about the gas gauge as a emotional regulation cue. And what this essentially means is if our nervous system's in that fight or flight state, and we start to notice some of those trauma signs, fight, flight, freeze, or peas, we have to do some regulation practices in order to fill up the tank in the gas in our tanks. So I talk about 5 primary ways to do it. The first is exercise. Doing different forms of exercise can be a great way to get back in the body, and especially if you're using the left and right hemisphere. Second is like physical contact. So getting a massage, petting your dog or your cat, your spouse, like holding hands, going on a walk. Think of different ways that, your kiddos, different ways that you can get physical contact because we co-regulate. The third is cold immersion. So if you can, cold shower. That's why cold plunges are so important. And what do we do in cold plunge? Like, you're also breathing, right? So it's also moving you into breath. If you don't have time for those or not in the mood, you can also splash cold water in 2/3 of your face. And that'll also turn on what's called the longest nerve in your body, which actually puts you into parasympathetic, is called the vagus nerve. And really that's what all these things are doing when we regulate. We're accessing the vagus nerve to take us from a sympathetic, which I described a minute ago, into a parasympathetic. And when you move into parasympathetic, your hair goes back down, your pupils go back to normal, and you get access back to your body. So everything turns back on. Is what they called rest and digest or feed and breed in general, but you're more regulated, you're calm, you're in a relaxed place. So 5 ways to do it. 1 is physical exercise. 2 is cold immersion. 3 is physical contact or physical touch. The 4th is breath. And the breath is one of the most powerful ways to do it. I primarily recommend 4-6 breathing. So breathing in for a count of 4, breathing out for a count of 6. And the last way to do it is using your vocal cords. So whether that be humming, singing, chanting, primal screaming, finding a way to just get into your vocal cords. So 5 primary ways to regulate nervous system or fill up your tank with gas.
I want a primal scream right now. How about it?
Yes, let it out.
I'll mute my mic. And just a disclaimer, when I lost my temper, it was not at work or with anyone at work. It was in my personal life. It's fine.
Hey, it's okay too, but it's just a way to move that energy so you can get back into your body. So for example, tough day personal life, sometimes it's hard, then you may take it out on somebody else. Or if you're in a fight or flight state, sometimes we end up distracting or avoiding or moving to distractions or numbing agents because our nervous system's just highly activated. And so if we can do these things in a daily routine, this is where you start to build in a reintegration practice, especially you had a tough day, you want to double down on some of these pieces, right? And that's just going to make sure you're like, oh, before I come home with my kiddos or my spouse, let me get regulated so that no matter what happened at work, I can take the armor off and I can actually come home and let it go before I get home. So 5 ways to regulate and 3 ways for purification. So think of purification as changing the oil. If you look down and the oil gauge is on and you do not change the oil, at some point your engine may seize, and that's going to be an even bigger problem and it may blow up. So
it cracks me up that you're using so many car references, because I literally, when I blew up a car that way, because I thought that changing the oil was a scam.
But you blew up a car. You actually blew up a car.
I literally, and I was coming home from Tahoe, and I was about 8.5 months pregnant. And it was a very terrible time to blow up your motor. It was also in a dead zone, so a lot of people had to get involved to help me. And there's this black smoke starts coming, and I'm like, what's going on? And then it just won't move. The tow truck comes, and of course the mechanic's like, why didn't you change the oil? Like, how long has it been? I was like, that's a scam. And he's like, that's an expensive lesson. And I was like, oh my gosh. So now I'm like, does the oil need to be, when do I need to change the oil?
I love this though, because
I'm loving your references, because I'm like, oh, wait, I've been there.
Well, and I love that you've been through it, because it actually, it validates the point that I'm making. Is I think so many people do the same thing, is they're like, I'm fine. And then the engine blows up. And unfortunately, when our engines blow up, it could mean a suicide. It could mean something really bad happens. And so making sure, think about it like this. When you put new oil in, it's like that goldenish color. And then by the time it's used, it turns into this like dark heavy, color. So think about it as we need to purify that out. So let's say you go through and you have a tough day, like you were just saying, hey, bad personal day. Let's say you do some of the regulation, it's still there. That's when you're going to want to move to some purification practices. And there's three primary ways to purify. And essentially, a lot of times what this means is it's not going away. It may be some heavy grief, it may be some deep sadness, it may be some trauma that's coming up that you can't fix. And maybe another time we'll talk about, I have 4 levels of emotional trauma and how to triage them, but this would be level 4, like an amputation, or level 3, which is like a severe break. And I use physical examples, but they're really emotional relatability to them of what happens emotionally. So let's say there's a severe break and you have a really bad day, you do the emotional protocols and you're still not feeling good. Think of purification as, one is meditation. Sitting down and meditate, highly recommend you have that in a daily practice just to give some time to purify. 2 is nature. Nature's a natural purifier. So get out, go on a hike, get into a lake. We got beautiful Tahoe here. Find a way to get, take your shoes off, get in the grass, find some way, take the family out to go camping for a weekend, go backpacking, find a way to get in nature is number 2. And the third way is, think of like transmutation. So pick up an instrument, play some music, dance, think of creativity, writing, different forms of moving that from a dense, heavy energy and transmuting it into something else. So purification is meditation, get into nature, or some sort of creative activity to transmute that into something else. So as I'm talking about these now, anybody that's listening, and as you as well, think about like, hey, what could I do daily to reintegrate, to come back home, looking at those 5 ways of regulation, those 3 ways of purification, which ones sound good to me that I could do every day as a ritual. So it's a reintegration ritual to go, hey, maybe I come home before I see like spouse, kids, and everybody else. I actually say, you know what, I'm going to take a shower, take my work clothes off, maybe change into clothes at home, maybe go for a quick walk, take the dog out, pet the dog, right? Maybe on the way home, you're singing a song or doing some primal screaming if it's a really tough day, right? And I'm just giving you some context, but what things could you build in to go, oh, wait, if I do these things every day, I know I'm going to be in a much better place to come home because I've regulated myself, filled up the tank of gas, and I've also purified myself and spent a little bit of time, or at least know if it's a really bad day and I regulate and it's still there, I might say, hey, let's go to Tahoe this weekend, right? And then you can even start to communicate that with your kids and your spouse and your family, so everybody's on the same page.
In days like that, like you said, if we're going through the purification and we're having kind of those days, it kind of helps re-regulate everyone, right? Because wouldn't you say we're all kind of, our gauge is different, like day to day, hour to hour, person to person?
Yeah, completely. And I find this is really helpful, actually, if you bring the whole family into it. And so I have these 4 levels of trauma. Just briefly, I'll say them really quick. Think of level 1 as like a blister and abrasion. Think of level 2 as like a sprained ankle. Think of level 3 as like a break, like a broken leg or bone. And think of 4 as like an amputation. Now we think about it physically, but imagine those emotionally. So a level 1 could just be a tough day. A level 2 could be COVID or some of these other things that have happened. Level 3 could be like, what could take you out for 6 months to a year, right? Much more severe. And think of level 4 as like, hey, there's like an amputation, something that I can't fix. I just have to accept and change it. So cliff notes are, level 1, it's just stress. Level 2 is increased stress. I can do those on my own. Level 3, I need help. I can't do it on myself. So I may need to get some help from a therapist, a friend, somebody else. I can't set the bone myself. I need some help. And level 4 is I have to accept that things, this is the way they are and they need to change. So imagine if somebody came home and said, hey, let's talk about it as a family. What things represent those 4 areas? So if I come home and say, hey, level 3 day, as a whole family, we know what to do together. So now we can start to reintegrate together, and anybody can call 3. Imagine somebody's kiddo said, hey, level 3 today, we all now know this was a severe event. We don't always have to talk about specifics, but we know what to do as a family to get regulated together and to purify together.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah, it's really helpful because a lot of times, most of the research shows with, suicide's the number 1 cause of death for fire, police, military, so many different organizations now. And all the research shows there's on-the-job trauma, but it actually happens at home. So that's why these practices are so important, is because if you come home, you're trying to hide things from your family. And I'm sure it's the same thing with therapists and counselors and veterinarians and ER doctors and nurses, and they just don't have all the stats yet. So, but if you come home and try to protect the family, nobody knows, you're trying to burden that instead of communicating to the family. And that's where a lot of the fighting and conflict happens, because we're unregulated. And then it triggers everybody else's nervous system, and then the whole family's fighting. So if everybody has permission to create these rituals together, now it can be compassionate and goes, oh, it's not me why they're activated. They just had a tough day, or they had a level 3 at school. Imagine a kid said level 3 because I was picked on or bullied, or we can now come together as a family and support each other versus creating conflict and fighting in the household.
Yeah. Yeah. Just, I mean, having communication in general, increases connection, right? But then also having this shared language of almost like the code word of code 3 or level 3, do you want to talk? No.
Yep.
And how can I support? Right.
Yeah,
and not always assuming that we know how to support others, and being mindful of asking too, right? Because sometimes it's like, level 3, let me dig. And sometimes that's not the best idea. I'd really like you to elaborate a little bit more on the traumas happening at work, but then the real damage happening at home. So is that because there isn't the communication? Is that because there's we're not reintegrating or regulating or taking the armor off? Or how would you kind of explain? Because I know that you're right. So many, like the fire department has a debriefing, right? Something bad happens, or they witness something, or they come on a scene, and then they'll have a debrief. So I don't know that it's enough support, but there's something there. And maybe there's even, with the military, there's the camaraderie, there's the brotherhood or the sisterhood or whatever the case is. What would you say is kind of missing coming home?
Yeah, it's the communication. And I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm a fighter out, I'm on the job, and let's say there's a fatality. And let's say I'm on the first of the scene. And let's say when I'm there, my adrenaline kicks in, I handle the scene. And it's not until I go home that I'm actually starting to process this. So they've done the job at the department. The challenge is I walk in the door and it's overwhelming, and I walk right into the garage. There's an actual example I use where a firefighter literally walked in the door and walked right in the, said hello, walked right in the garage and start cleaning. And that was their activated strategy. When they got activated, they would clean. Well, what do you think the spouse felt? Let's say they'd spent all day cleaning, preparing dinner, couldn't wait for their husband to get home. And let's say the same thing. Let's say they had a little boy couldn't wait for the dad to get home. He walks right in the door, says hi, and goes to the garage. What do you think my experience as a spouse? Do you think I thought, oh, he had a really tough day at the job? Or do you think I thought, what's wrong with me? Why is he mad at me? And then I get upset. And let's say my response is flight, and I get upset and I run upstairs. And what do you think the child's experiencing? The child's sitting there going, I was all excited for dad to get home. Now my other parents ran away, and now I'm all alone. I'm abandoned, right? So you see that little dynamic. Was it anybody's fault? Was anybody mad at each other? No. Somebody had some trauma on the job. They didn't have a language to come home and say, hey, level 3 day, can we come together as a family unit to support what's happening? Where it's nobody's fault. The response I'm having is because my nervous system's reacting to the trauma on the job. And let's come together as a family unit to solve this together. Instead, what happens is everybody's trying to protect each other, and it ends up creating the PTSD at home. Does that scenario give you a little bit more perspective?
Yeah, I think that was a great explanation. One of the kind of a different way that I say similar, so I'm not going to say the same thing, but similar, is I like to say, the ball rolls downhill. and my bad day could quickly turn into the dog getting kicked if I don't watch it, meaning not by me, but just those secondary interactions. Huge to have these skills. So for people listening today, there's a lot of information that was covered today, a lot going on. This is probably one you're going to listen to more than once and really have to sit and digest. But Joshua, do you have any kind of like last minute tips and tricks or like challenges for the audience of like, hey, if you're going through this, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I do. I'd say the biggest thing is like the nervous system awareness. Like, again, what we started at the beginning, practice CPR, practice becoming aware when you're activated, when you're fighting, when you're numbing, when you're avoiding, when you're cleaning, when you're any of that, fight, flight, freeze, or appease, and start to pause. And if anything, just do breath. Sit down and breathe. In breath for 4, out breath of 6 for 6 minutes, which is actually 36 breaths. And just practice doing that every time you notice it happening for a week. Like if you start to actually see a difference, which you will if you do it, or do a cold plunge, splash cold water in your face and breathe, go on a quick walk with the dog before you start to react, so you can actually choose to respond, everything will start to change. I see 80% of conflict going down in households when everybody starts to get on the same page. And if you can do it with your spouse or your kids and you guys become a team, everything changes. Now you guys are a team with what's happening in the world versus actually in conflict with each other.
Right. I know. Right. And so I'm sure there's some people like, what? That's possible.
It literally is like magic. Because again, you're learning to take charge of your nervous system and go from, really what you're doing is going from the back of your brain, which think of the back of your brain, make sure it's like what makes you sneeze. You kind of stop a sneeze, but like what makes your heartbeat, what makes your breath work, like the reptilian part of your brain is for survival. That's the reactionary part. So when you move into a fight or flight state, literally the brain sends a signal going, we're in danger, get us out of here. And it reacts before you can even think about it. It's literally no different than a sneeze. So what we have to learn, because our brains aren't fully developed toward 26, is to learn how to recognize when we're in those reactive states, pause. And if you can learn to turn on that parasympathetic, what ends up happening is you go to the front of your brain. The front of your brain is compassion, empathy, and executive functioning. And very simply put, you're able to rationally think through like, oh, what else could this mean? Oh, I have compassion for my spouse, my kids, my family. I have empathy. And that gives you a whole different set of tools to solve it versus just reaction. And if you actually start to see it, it becomes a new way of life because you have power. You actually feel empowered to make good decisions. And if you don't, then you're in reaction. And that's when we blow things up and break things out. We move from a 3 to a 4. We move from something that's broken and we amputate. So I know people, everybody's listening to going like, oh, things aren't working. I'm done, or I'm leaving this career, or I'm blowing this up, or we move to a 4 when it could be solved and put back together if we give ourselves just a little bit more time.
Oh, I love it. And I have to just emphasize something you said. You said, when you realize you have the choice, there is a choice.
Yeah. Awareness is a function of choice. And if you can pause and do this practice, it gives you choice versus reaction. That's why I call it moving from reaction to a conscious response. Because if you can choose to respond, how different is that? I mean, has anybody ever said, oh, I want to enter in the blank, not eat the food, love my spouse, don't yell at my spouse, right? Like there's a certain thing we want to do, but instead we react and do it anyway. That's because you're in the back of your brain reacting. If you literally start to get in control of this, you now have a choice, which changes the whole game.
Beautiful. So, wow. I mean, I know why I wanted you back. I was like, we got to have another because I mean, it's so content rich. And I mean, this episode is just, there's so much in there to just help. So I'm really hoping that, our listeners got a lot out of it. I got a lot out of it, another full page of notes. So Joshua, where could people find you? If they want to know more, if they're like, I'm intrigued, I need to go deeper, where can they find you?
Yep. So I'm at Joshua Michael Wenner, and it's Wenner. I'm on Instagram. My website's the same thing, Facebook. And that typically leads everybody where they need to go. I also have K4 Men's Work and Valor Resiliency, but the primary place is joshuamichaelwenner.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on again and sharing all your goodies and your wisdom and truly making this world a better place, right? That's what I'm all about. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me back again. So much fun.
This has been Humanity Meets Business Therapy with Christine Salvo, licensed marriage and family therapist, advanced certified mediator, and master NLP and hypnosis practitioner. Thanks so much for listening and have a wonderful day. Good morning. Welcome to Humanity Meets Business Therapy with Christine Salvo.